Today we're going to learn how to convert between percents, fractions, and decimals. So the title of our page should be Percents, Fractions, and Decimals. Okay, so let's just get right into it. We're going to start off by converting percents to fractions. Okay, and the way we convert percents to fractions is we write the percent as the numerator out of 100. Okay, remember the numerator is the top number in a fraction. So if you think about like what percent is out of, if you get all the questions right on your test and there's no extra credit, you would get 100%, right? So percent is out of 100. Now there are situations where you can get more than 100 with like extra credit, but percent is out of 100. Let me see if I can get a highlighter. So if you do have a highlighter with you, we want to highlight this little piece right here, because we're going to be doing a whole bunch of these types of problems and you want it to be able to stick out which one that we are doing. Let's just start off with some examples. The first example we're going to do is 32%. Okay, 32% means 32 over 100. We're writing it out of 100, numerator over 100. Okay, so that's our first answer. Let's try 4%. At any time you can feel free to work ahead and just check your answers at the video. This should be 4 over 100. Notice how it's not 40%, so it's not 40 over 100. 4% is 4 over 100. The third example, 52%. Try this one on your own. I'll give you a minute. Write that as a fraction. For these fractions, we don't need to simplify them, so we just leave them. Here we'd have 52 over 100. So we're starting off easy. That's how you write a percent as a fraction. Let's reverse that. Let's write a fraction as a percent. So fraction to percent. Okay, the first thing we need when we're writing a fraction into a percent is we need the fraction to be out of 100. Because if we get that fraction to be out of 100, then just our numerator is our percent, right? That makes it really easy. So we want a fraction over 100. And I'll show you an example where we won't have that, but we can make it into that. And then the numerator is the percent. Again, if you have a highlighter, let's go ahead and highlight. Because then when you are looking back at these notes, if you need to use them on your homework today or in the future, you can just see these highlighted sections and jump to what you need. First example, we have 27 over 100. This is nice and easy. It already is a fraction out of 100. So our numerator is our percent. This would equal 27%. Second example, 7 over 10. No, I guess if we're going to keep it the same, let's write 7 over 10. It'll be easier this way. Now this one's not a fraction out of 100, but we can make 10 into 100 really simple. Think to yourself, what do we multiply 10 by to make it into 100? Whatever we do on the bottom, we must do on the top. 10 times 10 is 100. That's what you should have said. So we'd multiply by 10 on the top. This fraction now becomes 70 over 100. Which then, now that we have it a fraction over 100, the percent is 70%. This last one I want you to try on your own if you haven't already. 78 over 100. I'll pause and give you some time to write that as a percent. Answer here should be 78%. All right, so that's making percents into fractions, fractions into percents. Now let's move into some decimals. Let's make percents into decimals and then decimals into percents. So first let's start with that percent and make it into a decimal. The way that we do this is we move the decimal 2 places to the left. Move decimal twice left. And remember, left is going this way. So if you want to draw a little arrow reminder, that will help you out. Again, if you have a highlighter, let's highlight that category. All right, so let's do some examples. So here we've got 54%, starting off with a percent. Think about the number 54. Think about $54.00 or $54.50. Where is that decimal in the number 54? Well, it should be at the end of that 54, behind that 4. When we say move the decimal twice left, it means move it 2 decimal places to the left. So the 1 place would be 5.4. Move it once more to the left. Put our decimal in here. This becomes 0.54, 54 hundredths, which makes sense because percent is out of 100. This is 54 over 100. We always want to put that 0 in before the decimal, just so that we see that decimal. Otherwise, sometimes if it's just like on a paper and it's just randomly there, it's sometimes just looks like a period, or we just don't push our pencil hard enough. So we like to put that 0 before so that it's really easy to see where that decimal is. Next example is 30%. Again, if you're feeling comfortable, work ahead. In $30, the decimal comes behind the 0. We move it 1, 2 places, and it becomes 0.30. Now remember, zeros at the end of a decimal, as long as there's no number after it, can be dropped off. So this could be 0.30 or 0.3. Either of those would be correct answers. Okay. This next one's going to be tricky. We haven't done an example like this. Same thing, think about $3. Where is that decimal place in $3? It's after the 3. We move it once to the left, twice to the left. Now think about all the other times where we have empty spaces. We have to fill that space with a 0. So this decimal becomes 0.03. This 0 we cannot drop off because it's not at the end. There's a number after that 0, so we need to keep it here. So our decimal is 0.03. Okay. Let's reverse that process. Let's make decimals into percents. So if we made a percent into a decimal by moving it twice to the left, think to yourself, how do you think we might make a decimal into a percent? We're going to basically do the opposite. So we are going to move that decimal twice right. Again, if you want to draw that little arrow, right is going that way. If you have a highlighter, highlight that title. And then let's do some examples. We have 0.72. We are going to take that decimal, and this is nice because the decimal's already in here for when we're making a decimal into a percent. We're going to move it once, twice, and we would get 72%. We can drop off that 0 in the front because it's a 0. If that was like a 1.72, we would need to keep that 1 and it would be 172%. We won't really be dealing with numbers that big, but when there's a 0 in front of that decimal, we can drop it off when we're writing it as a percent. All right, here we have 0.04. Again, work ahead if you're feeling comfortable. Move that decimal twice to the right. 1, 2. Both of these zeros will be dropped off because 0.004%. There's no decimals in here, so we don't need these zeros right here. This just becomes 4%. All right, try this next one. Same idea. We might have to fill an empty space with this one, just like we did with our last example up here, but we are still moving it 2 times to the right. Fill that empty space with a 0. This becomes 90%. Now we can't drop that 0 off because it's a part of the percent. If we drop that 0 off, think about if you got 9% on a test or if you got 90%. I'm sure a lot of us at home are thinking, yeah, I'd rather have 90%, right? So that does make a difference. You can always ask yourself those questions to kind of check if you need those zeros or not. Okay. Last skill we are working on today is making decimals into fractions and fractions into decimals. Now these are the harder ones, which is why I kept them for the end. As always, feel free to work ahead if you are catching on to what you should be doing. So here we're going to make decimals into fractions first. This is the easier of the two. When we make decimals into fractions, we use the place value name. And I'll show you what that means in a minute. Again, if you have a highlighter, highlight that title. Okay, so when we have a place value or a decimal number, say we have 3.357. Okay, this first decimal place that's right here is called the tenths. Tenths, meaning that it's out of 10. This 5 right here is in the hundredths. Hundredths. This 7 right here is in the thousandths. Okay, so tenth, hundredths, thousandths. This is out of 10, this is out of 100, this is out of 1,000. Okay, so let's do an example of what I mean by that. So this decimal, sorry, before we move on, will be pronounced 357,000. So you always name it with the last number where the place value is for that last number. Okay, so let's do 0.25. We would say tenths, hundredths. So this 5 is in the hundredths. So we would say this as 25 hundredths, and that's exactly how we write it as a fraction. 25 hundredths, 25 over 100. As long as we know these decimal places, these are not that bad. Okay, try this next one. Look at where the 5 is. We would pronounce this as 5 tenths. So we would write that as 5 over 10, 5 tenths. Again, try this next one if you're feeling comfortable. 0.07. The 7 is in the hundredths place. So we would call this 7 hundredths. Now this is not 7 tenths because a 7 is in the hundredths place. So make sure that we are not mistaking that. Okay. This last one gets a little tricky. That's why we left so much space for it. So let's make fractions into decimals and then we are done with this lesson for today. Well, I guess I didn't know any of the other ones, so you don't have to underline that. We'll highlight it once we're done writing. So when we're making fractions into decimals, there's 2 different things we can do. The first thing you want to try to do is get the fraction out of 10 100, or 1,000. And the reason being for that is because then we can use those decimal place values the same way we did before. If we can get the fraction to be with a denominator of 10, 100, or 1,000, we can just use that place value to write the decimal. However, if we have like an 8 at the bottom as our denominator, we can't make an 8 into a 10, 100, or 1,000 by multiplying. So we would have to do long division. And we'll do an example of that. But I believe most of the numbers on like your quiz or test that you'd have to do about this would be nice numbers that you could get to be 100. Highlight that. All right. So first example, 5 over 10. We check out that fraction. We say, is that out of 10, 100, or 1,000? Yes. How do we say this fraction? We say this fraction is 5/10. So let's just write it as 5/10. And then add in that 0 before the decimal. The 5 should be in the 10ths place. We double check our work that way. That's it. All right, let's try 7 over 20. Now 20 isn't 10, 100, or 1,000, but we could make it into a 10 by dividing it by 2. But 7 divided by 2, that's a decimal, so that's not very easy to do. We can make 20 into 100. Think to yourself, 20 times what is 100? Times 5. Whatever we do to the bottom, we do to the top. So this would become 35 over 100. So for that one, then we can just do 35 hundredths. So the 5 needs to be in the hundredths. The 3 comes before it, then the decimal. Double check, tenths, hundredths. Yep, that's in the right spot. Put in our 0 before. We are good to go. All right, I told you I was saving the hardest one for the last. All right, let's say 2/8. 2/8. 8 we cannot be a 10, 100, or 1,000. So here's where we need to do some long division. Remember that a fraction bar is a division sign. So this means the same thing as 2 divided by 8. So 2 is getting divided by 8. Okay, 8 can go into 2 0 times. So you're probably like, okay, cool, we're done. Nope. In order to keep going, remember when we learned long division, we add a decimal and a 0. Because $2 is the same thing as $2.00. So we didn't change the number. We bring that decimal straight up. And now we can say 8 can go into 20 2 times, because 8 times 2 is 16. So now we forget about this decimal down here. We're just pretending that that's a 20, because we already brought it up into our answer. We have to borrow to make that a 10. 10 minus 6 is 4. 1 minus 1 is 0. Again, since we have a remainder, we have no more numbers to bring down. We can add another 0 after that decimal. Because remember, $2.00 is the same thing as $2.00. Once we add that 0, we can then bring it down. 8 can go into 40 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40. We're left with a 0 remainder, no numbers to bring down, so our decimal is 0.25. If you like that method better than finding a fraction out of a 10 or 100 or 1,000, you could use this any single time. This will always work as long as you do your math right. Okay? This method will not always work, because if it's a number that you can't get to be a 10, 100, or 1,000, you have to do long division. So it's kind of your choice for this one, which method you use. And that is all for today's lesson.